we're past our 7 o'clock time, so let's, and we do have a quorum, so Glenn, if you could call the roll, please.
Certainly. Member Bergman.
Here.
Member George.
Here.
Member Liebel.
Here.
Member Minor.
Here.
Member Nickel.
Here.
Vice Chair Richardson.
Here.
And Chair Kraus.
Here.
We have a
we have a quorum. Thank you. Welcome to all. This is the Village of Lake Bluff Historic Preservation Commission at our regular February meeting, February 10th, 2021. A nice warm day outside. At least there was some sunshine. We have a number of items, the most important of which is continuation of our series of listening sessions on proposed revisions to the Historic Preservation Ordinance. Before we do that, we do have two quick items of business. The first is consideration of the November 11, 2020 regular board minutes. Those were distributed to us via email prior to this meeting, and I would entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Motion. Sherry with a motion, Paul with a second. Do we have any discussion? Hearing none, a roll call vote, please.
Certainly. Member Bergman.
Yes.
Member George.
Yes.
Member Liebel.
Yes.
Member Minor.
Yes.
Member Nickel.
Yes.
Vice Chair Richardson.
Yes.
And Chair Kraus.
Yes, motion is approved. Our next item, as is our policy, we have an allocated portion of time at the beginning of each meeting for individuals who are in the audience, either live or remote, to address the commission on items that are not on the agenda tonight, but are within our purview. Are there any audience members who would like to address the commission? Hearing none, we'll go into our primary discussion this evening, and that is continuation of our listening session on proposed changes to the Historic Preservation Ordinance. Glenn, could you give us an update on our audience for tonight, both in person and online?
Certainly. So I am, as usual, all alone here in Village Hall. We have 5, looks like individuals. Of course, could be more. 5 viewing clients, if you would, joining us on the Zoom meeting.
Okay, so we have a short background presentation that I'd like to start right now. After we go through this presentation, we will open up the Zoom lines, if there are such a thing, to the audience so that we can continue our dialogue and get more feedback. And once we have gotten the feedback from audience members, I would like to spend some time with the commission in talking through next steps. We have one more general session next Tuesday evening, at which point I would like to have some discussions around, what we've learned and where we have consensus. But before we do that, let's go through this particular presentation. Our focus tonight is on financial considerations, financial concerns, although we will talk about any issue that a member of the public would like to talk about. When we talk about financial concerns, some of the comments that we received in November and following are primarily around 2 things. One is the real estate burden on property owners, comments around potentially concerning that it would be harder to sell property, concerns about current and future property values decreasing or not increasing as fast. There were also concerns around economic burden on a property owner. And my interpretation of that is the additional lift in order to make changes or upgrade an existing structure. And then there were a number of comments related to financial concerns, but from the other perspective, that the comments were and the gist of those comments were that the village needs financial incentives for preservation, not restrictions. So asking us to focus on incentives and not adding additional restrictive burdens to property owners. But again, we'll talk about financial, but we'll talk about every item that people wish. So one of the things we heard loud and clear were questions from village residents about why are we doing this? Why are we proposing changes to the historic preservation ordinance? So rather than go through each of the specific changes in detail, which we've done and is available online, what we have decided to do is to identify focus areas, 5 focus areas that provide the high level, why are we doing this, the answer to that question, starting with focus area number 1, which is the first slide. So this is really the big picture. Why do we have a historic preservation ordinance in the village now? And why are we looking to make changes to strengthen that ordinance? So the real purpose of historic preservation is to encourage, primarily through education, the preservation and rehabilitation of historic structures in Lake Bluff. So I like to think of having a bias for preservation when we think about upgrading and developing the village, which is great, having a historic structure and upgrading it within the context of its history, upgrading it into a modern, eminently livable home is exactly what we're hoping to do. So encouraging preservation and rehabilitation, and the flip side then is to discourage demolition of those structures. So we heard in developing our recommendations a couple of things, one of which was uncertainty, a feeling that a new, especially a potential new buyer in Lake Bluff, wouldn't completely understand which structures are subject to landmarking and restrictions on teardowns especially, and which weren't. So one of the things that we're hoping to do is to have clarity around the landmarking process and around the structures that are and are proposed to be landmarked. One of the ways to do that in a big way is a data repository, a place where people can go, a database online that summarizes all of the landmarks within the village, looks at every structure within the village and summarizes the relevance of that structure to the history of Lake Bluff. We're calling that Choose Lake Bluff, and we'll have a quick demo of that in a minute. So that's one part of the educational process. The second part is that what we really have wanted to do from the beginning for 15 plus years is, through education, to encourage property owners to nominate their property for landmark status, so that they can recognize, and the village can recognize, the context of those structures in the development of Lake Bluff. People who live there, the architect, the builder, the developer, the context of that structure in the overall history of the village. So that's the second piece, is to promote owner-nominated landmarking. And a third, that's critical, we don't often talk about this, but there are significant incentives, primarily real estate tax incentives, to encourage property owners to rehabilitate historic structures. One of the underlying principles of especially the state preservation incentives is that the incentive program has to be driven by a local historic preservation group, and the Historic Preservation Commission, this body, is that group for Lake Bluff. So we serve as the repository of data and the sharer of information around opening up access to incentives for individual property owners. So with that as a quick overview, Glenn, if you could take us through a couple of examples of the beta version of Lake Bluff Online, still under development. There'll be a lot more information added to the database in the next months.
Certainly. So this is at least what we've called it as a tentative basis is Lake Bluff Online, perhaps some new branding yet to follow, and it really has two feature sets, right? The first, I think the simplest to explain is, I'm an individual and I want to learn about a house. So you can select any property in the village, you can search it by address, you can just click on a map, and you can find out a mix of information taken from public records and from the village's various historic preservation efforts over the years. So in this case, you can see that we have this 700 East Center, one of our landmarks. We've landmarked it. There's information about architectural style for those properties for which we know the architect. There's details about the architect. There's a photo from the assessor's office. And then if you click on a local survey record, you'll see the full extent of data from our local surveys on a particular property. So this data is taken straight from the survey. There's really a derivative or an expanded version of this data that's been put together by volunteers over at the museum. In this case, this study was done back in the 90s, so it can serve, hopefully, for most of the properties we've looked at, additional information beyond what was just available in the survey at the time is on file at the museum. And that's something we hope to bring back in and integrate. But when we look at details like architectural style or, again, some of these are fairly simple. You don't need to be an architect to know them, like the roof type or the roof materials. But in 10 or 15 or 20 years, maybe you do need to know them. And so this gives us really a place to leverage again, public records, the village's records, and the expertise we've retained in completing these studies of the village. The other feature set here, if you would, is really this data writ large, taken in bulk, taken for swaths of the village. So of course there's color coding here. These colors correspond to, I'll try to zoom this in a bit so you can see, these colors correspond to levels of historic significance that have been assigned to these properties by the village's various surveying efforts. And then you can search if you're interested in houses built in the 1960s. We can highlight those for you. If you're interested in houses that were designed, say, by David Adler, a notable architect who has done some work in the village, we can identify those for you. And so, again, in addition to learning about an individual property or properties as a homeowner or as someone interested in moving to Lake Bluff, we also are trying to give you a feature set that can help you to explore and learn more about the village that lives in tandem with the more narrative resources in our historic surveys, with the materials put out by the Lake Bluff History Museum, especially the tours of the village, and also, again, taking advantage of all this information. We have to offer here at Village Hall that we can do a better job of helping the public to interact with. The last thing I'll note before I turn it back over to Chair Kraus is the village has, at this point, historic data for just about all residences in the village. We've intentionally haven't surveyed relatively new ones, but you'll see many of these are shown in white as no data available because we're still in the process of loading that data in. There's been some changes to a few things, including how the state publishes and identifies their historic resources that have caused a few snags. But stay tuned for the final copy.
So stay on that if you could, Glenn.
Certainly.
This is the beta version. So we have every property identified. We have, for the ones that are color coded, we have a base template. We will soon have all of the village filled in with a base template. So every property will have at least a beginning point for gathering data. We will have a lot more photographs. We're working on those now to add. We will also have what we have for structures on the National Register. Glenn, can you zoom on one of the National Register homes, please?
Certainly.
And what we've loaded here is the actual National Register application. So if you could just pull one of those up.
I'm happy to do
So
that,
if
but
you're interested in,
fair warning that I believe the state of Illinois has withdrawn this information from publication.
okay.
Yeah, that's one of the difficulties we're trying to work around, unfortunately.
Okay. So the idea here is that all of the information that we have for our landmarks, the landmark application that was approved by the village, for National Register structures or for national districts within the village, we'll have that information. We will also be importing from the county all the data that they have online. So all of the historic tax information will be available as part of the online database. So more to come on Lake Bluff Online, but it is the data repository for information on historic significance of every structure in the village. You have a person has a place to go when they're interested in purchasing a property or upgrading their home to understand the relevance from a historic context of that structure to the village. So that's the basic education focus area. The second focus area, if we could go to that, Glenn, is a commitment on the part of the commission to actually get to the business of landmarking. We have 20-some, I think, structures landmarked. We think there are more, I've been saying a double handful more, that deserve landmark status. And we, again, under this concept of knowing, having certainty when you want to buy a home, if it's a landmark or subject to landmark status, we will be undertaking a landmarking initiative, identifying structures likely to be nominated as a landmark, and complete this process within 3 years. So we have committed to identifying individual structures that the commission and the village board will be reviewing for landmark status quickly, and then going through working with the property owner, hopefully having the property owner fully on board with landmarking, and going through that process to be completed within roughly a 3-year time period. The third focus area is what some consider to be the most important piece here. So why are we doing this? Why are we putting in historic preservation controls over potential demolitions, which is what we're most concerned about, and changes? So one of the origins of this ordinance 15 plus years ago was the reaction that people like myself had. When I was working, I worked downtown, and I would walk back and forth from the train station. And during a 5-year period of time, every so often, I'd be walking into the train station in the morning and see a bulldozer in front of a house, and walk back at night and try to remember what used to be there. There was no opportunity for community input, no opportunity for discussion of alternatives. No notification required of neighbors. It was just a tear down, regardless of the potential historic nature of that home. So from the beginning, historic preservation in Lake Bluff is designed to allow meaningful time for community discussion, for neighbors to discuss the impact on the proposed demolition or modification of what we're calling community anchors. Those structures that exemplify Lake Bluff, that are the visual symbols of what Lake Bluff was and what Lake Bluff is. Those structures that represent Lake Bluff and its history. So that's why this is in place, to give community, to give residents an opportunity to understand what is being proposed with one of our anchor structures. It's important to recognize that unlike many of our neighboring communities, the ultimate control over use of a property resides with the property owner. So the property owner ultimately can do what they wish to do within normal zoning, planning, et cetera, rules, but the control of the property rests with the property owner. In certain situations, there may be delays, and I will talk about what those are, but ultimately the property owner makes those decisions on their own right. So we have three things to think about here. Which structures do we as a commission review? And when there's a proposal for demolition or for significant alteration. A significant alteration is defined as essentially 50%, a change that involves 50% or more of the structure. So which ones do we look at? We have a trigger point, a threshold of 50-year-old structures. So any structure that is at 50 years old or older, for which the village has received a demolition request or a significant alteration request, that request triggers a review by the Historic Preservation Commission. That's been in place now for over 15 years. That's not a change. The 50-year is a number that matches the year threshold for the National Register of Historic Places, which is why we come across that number. Okay, so you own a 50-plus-year-old house and you're looking to do something to it. What is the commission's process? So then we have to think, is this a landmark or is this not a landmark? A landmark is a home that has gone through a series of public meetings and has received a recommendation from the Historic Preservation Commission and approval by the village board to be identified as a village landmark. There are 20-some of those landmarks that now exist. If you're not a landmark, then the process works this way. So if you're a non-landmark property and that home is 50 years old or older, the Historic Preservation Commission reviews either a demolition or a significant alteration and may delay the village, the commission and the village board combined may delay up to 180 days the issuance of a building permit or a demolition permit. We'll show you in a minute what our history has been. Most reviews are much less than 180 days. Most reviews are done, and we hope to have most reviews of non-landmarks done in less than a month. But the opportunity, again, is to provide community input in a public forum for alterations to older structures. So that's a non-landmark. If you're a landmark, and these are the ones that we're very interested, there's an enhanced level of scrutiny and more time for input for those relatively small number of structures that have been awarded landmark status. In those situations, the village, HPC, and the village board, who gets involved fairly quickly, may delay up to 365 days. That's our proposal. It is now 150 days. We're looking to add a significant number of additional days as part of our recommendations. Alterations we're recommending could be delayed for up to 60 days. So, quick summary. Trigger point is a 50-year-old home or more with a demolition or a significant modification. If you own a home, or if you want to buy a home that is less than 50 years old, or if you own a home or want to buy a home that is 50 years old or older, but you're looking to add an addition or make changes that's not significant, that doesn't impact 50% of the exterior walls, you don't need to go through the review. But if you trigger review, those are the potential discussions and the conversations that we'll have. And if there's the questions about this, we can handle them during the question period. So Glenn, I said we would talk a bit about what the history has been around delays, and if you could run through this slide, I appreciate it.
Certainly. So on this slide, you see the same chart twice, spanning the one on the right is a subset of the one on the left. So on both charts, the y-axis up and down is the number of properties, the number of reviews really that have been conducted by this body. And then we have three categories. So from left to right are reviews that have taken between 1 and 35 days, which generally means one meeting of this body to conclude. In the second column, you have 36 to 71 days. So again, that's roughly 2 months or 2 meetings of this body. And in the third column is where you get into greater than 70 days. That's 3 or more meetings of this body, and that's generally, not always, but generally where that process has gone through to the required expiration of review that we have here in Lake Bluff. So you can see in the left-hand chart, this is every review that the HPC has ever done. And we can see that in a majority of those, it's done in your reviews, whether they're advisory reviews or demolition reviews, they're done in one meeting. And then certainly there are some that go longer. The right-hand chart is a subset. Again, it's just from 2017 to the present. That corresponds really with some stability in this ordinance, but a big enough period of time where there's been, I think, a pretty representative sample, right? About 20 projects. Coincidentally, it's also the amount of time I've been with the village, so these are projects I can personally speak to. And you can see overwhelmingly that projects are brought to this body and discharged in about a month. There's just 3 projects that have extended on longer than that. I'd have to look, but I think the way we calculated it, the example some of you are familiar with the state of Illinois, I think that's counted as 2 one-month reviews, not a prolonged period. But again, this body saw it and discharged it immediately on both occasions. So that's just a snapshot of the work that's been done by this body and under these regulations over the last 16 years.
Thanks. Keep this up for a sec. So one of the important things to think about, look at the right-hand side of the slide. So from 2017 to 2020, so 3 years, we have only had 19 situations that have triggered Historic Preservation Commission review. So 19 in 3 years. This is not an every month, every day, every year, every quarter activity. There's a handful every year, and we try to dispose of those as quickly as we can. So I want to dispel what I think is a potential point of concern for individuals, that this review is onerous, that every demolition request or every significant alteration request has to come before this body for its approval. That's not true. Very few of them do. And now go to the next slide, if you would. The ones that come before us, we want even more to minimize procedural delays. We want people who buy a new home or upgrade their existing home, as many of us in the village have done, and are excited about the process. We, especially if it's an older home that people want to upgrade to modern standards, we want that to happen. We appreciate it happening. It's the lifeblood of the village. People, new owners moving in, doing great things with the village. You walk around the village and you see lots of great renovation projects that have occurred. We don't want to be a delay, but we do want a process that allows for community input into what's happening in their neighborhood. And we feel that we can come up with a good fast-track process with a vast majority of reviews. And remember, these are only 50 years old or older, total demolition or significant modification. And we feel the majority of those are perfectly appropriate for the village and should be given fast-track approval. And the couple that aren't, we want an opportunity to have as much input and a thorough community discussion of changes as possible. So that's our fourth focus area, is to minimize procedural delays. And our fifth focus area gets to the issue of historic districts. Now, this has created more discussion than any other proposal that we have had in this couple of year process. So we, as a commission, believe that neighbors who own property in the village, who are interested in preserving their streetscape, and who wish to work together with their neighbors to create a enforceable historic district, a preservation of streetscape, that those property owners who want to do that should have a process in place to make that happen. So we have modified our original proposal slightly, still in the discussion phases, but to suggest that districts initiated by property owners, it's the only way they could be initiated in this proposal, are something that we want to enable for those property owners or groups of neighbors who wish to preserve their neighborhood streetscape. And again, we'll be happy to talk much more about that as we go forward. So those are the 5 focus areas. And with that, I would like, Len, if you could open up for questions or comments from the audience and from commissioners.
Certainly. So just by way of introduction, unlike most of our public meetings here, trying to have we can't all be together, but we try to be together at the same table. So instead of calling people up to speak, we'll give everyone the ability to turn on your audio, your video. So I'll go through here in a moment. You'll be disconnected briefly, and then it'll automatically reconnect you as someone, again, that can send audio and video. We just ask that while you're not speaking, you keep your microphone muted to help reduce feedback that's happening in the room. And with that, I will note during the transition period, one of our listeners is again Miss Deborah Fisher, who's a local realtor and who, as of Monday, is now has volunteered and been appointed to serve on the village's Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals. So, congratulations to Miss Fisher.
Congratulations. You'll have fun with that one. Do we have comments or questions from our audience?
While people are gathering their thoughts, I'll also note that Ali Caskey has joined us yet again from Lake Forest College. So again, we're happy to have her back as well.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Do we just speak up here as we want to talk, or I did not see a place to raise a hand?
This is fine. We have a small enough group that we can just continue. We can have an interactive dialogue. So please.
I am here with my husband. It's Pat and Paul Carollo. We're at 115 East Center Avenue, and we've been privileged to be honored with the Bleat Center Award and the other local awards for historic preservation. And we, like many people and probably you guys, we've been here for over 25 years in Lake Bluff, and as historic home owners, I am just a little, I become a little concerned with the national registration of historic places as a homeowner and my marketability of my home and what that perception is in Lake Forest, and I think the processes in Lake Forest has been a detriment for people buying homes in a historic district as well as renovating homes. And we've all done our renovations to make our homes livable for our families. And I kind of feel like the process that has been in place has been working, and I'm just wondering, it has been working to do a lot of the things you've tried to do, and I'm wondering, is there a need for change? And that is it.
Okay, great. And thank you for investing in Lake Bluff like many of us have, and you know, doing what it takes to live in an old house. So those of us that do that understand how great it is, and every once in a while you wonder, why did I do this? Especially when you're in the rehabilitation process. Answering directly for your question, there's very little that we're suggesting needs to be changed. So there's very little that we're suggesting that we actually change. So first of all, we never have, and we are not now concerned with anything that happens in the interior of any house in the village, historic or not, 50 years old or not. So property owners who wish to upgrade the interior of their home, go for it. You know, we all do that. If we live in our house long enough, we think it's a positive part of rehabilitating the housing stock in the village. And we don't intend to look at interior structures at all. So that's one thing. Second thing, we are not increasing the number of structures that we are going to be looking at. So the 50-year threshold, and I use the National Register and only as the reason that we use a 50-year, that way back when we put a 50-year threshold for reviewing modifications or demolitions. That's the standard that they use, but this in no way, a local landmark in no way has any linkage to a National Register activity unless the property owner wishes to do that on their own. So this is a separate village-initiated landmark process. What we are looking to do are a couple of things. From the perspective of efficiency, we have heard loud and clear that people are concerned about process and are concerned about being delayed or jumping through unnecessary administrative hoops in order to do what they want to do with their property. We're doing everything we can in our proposal to eliminate those administrative requirements. We will be developing, if this is approved, a fast-track process for the vast majority of structures that fall under the purview of the commission. And we're looking to add certainty in landmarking, which is the one thing that does have some additional administrative restrictions. But we're looking to add certainty by agreeing to pre-identify those double handful of structures, homes, and things like the train station or village hall or schools that either are now or will in the future be looked at for potential landmarking. So our vision is that give us 3 months, give us the middle of this year if this gets approved, you know, in the first quarter. Give us a couple of months, and everyone in the village will know which structures are already landmarked and which structures that we are going to look at over the next couple of years. Work with the property owners to understand the history of the structure and identify any concerns that they might have. So the bottom line here is that we are putting our position is that if we are in the business of preserving history in Lake Bluff, we should and will be focused on landmarks, the anchor structures that we all know are part of and representative of the history of Lake Bluff, We will be focusing on landmarking those, working with the property owners to the degree that we can. Hopefully we can with all. And we'll be recommending a extended review period, a year, before there is a demolition or a significant modification to that structure. So that's where we're putting our emphasis on those individual structures. One other thing, I should have led with this as well. For historic homes, many homes, mine was a good example, were small. There were small homes on small lots. I've put 3 small additions in 25 years on my house. I look around at all of us, and I think most of us have done that, have put additions on or have modified, and that's fine. We do recognize that historic homes need to be upgraded, interior certainly, but also in the exterior. We want to work and do work with property owners who are looking to put additions on the historic homes as a sounding board for having that addition be sensitive to the structure that existed, the history of that home. We are not and never will suggest that if you have a historic home, even a landmark, that you can't add on to it, that you can't upgrade it to make it livable. We want to preserve what we can, preserve the context, but we perfectly recognize that homes need to be upgraded for this, for modern living. They need to be upgraded in ways that the property owner wishes to upgrade. So, Pat and Paul, I hope that answered your questions. If not, let's try again.
Thank you. Somewhat, and I feel like as historic homeowners, and we've been in this house in particular for over 20 years, that, I have a really good feel about the history of my home and we respect our home as a historic home in Lake Bluff. But what I don't have a very good understanding of is what the boundaries of an historic district in Lake Bluff would be, and if my home would be in those boundaries, and then would my home have to become part of that, or is that elective? And I'm pretty good about understanding my home. I don't understand that whole process, procedure, and where those regulations come in. And then one other question, Steve. In your example with your home, which is a beautiful home, by the way, and the additions, would in this new format, would those additions count towards modifying the 50% of the exterior of a home? That's it.
Okay. Let's deal with historic districts first. And I guess the answer is it's really going to be up to the property owners, the neighbors, to determine the boundaries of a historic district. So rather than have an outside party, the folks you see on the screen, the Historic Preservation Commission, the village, some other outside body, make a determination as to what should be included in a district or what shouldn't be. We are attempting to facilitate neighbors who wish to preserve their streetscape, who wish to preserve the context of their neighborhood, and in order to do that are willing to abide by higher standards, i.e. by having a longer review period. Still, you can do what you want with your house, but having a longer review period for modifications or certainly for demolition. But we believe that a group of residents who wish to create a sense of place by creating a historic district, that's really what that is. It's a sense of place. Something happened here that's more than just one structure. It's a community. I would think a relatively small community. I would not, for example, suggest that East Lake Bluff become a district. I would not suggest that, although you could, I would not suggest that the camp meeting area be a district. But I think that there are subsets where neighbors want to preserve or want to create the sense of place that neighbors would be able to do that. So what are the parameters? The parameters are neighbors banding together to form a district. What are the voting rules? We frankly have to work those out. There will be a vote. Whether that vote ultimately, so the way we envision this is that residents meet and discuss over a relatively long period of time what that district should be, why it's relevant, do the history of the district and of the individual structures within the district, in effect, define the boundaries of that area, that sense of place. And then working with the village, first with the HPC and then with the village board, have a formal application for landmark status. The village board would consider public hearings, open meetings, and then the owners of property within that proposed district would then vote.
Can I
we
clarify?
need.
I think
Go
you
ahead.
said landmark. You said this was for a landmark, but it's really for the historic districting, right?
What I'm addressing right now is the question on what is a historic district and how would it get set up.
But you're not, I think I just heard you say that each house in there would be landmarked. That's not what you meant, right?
Each house would not be landmarked, but the effect of being in a historic district would be that each property within that district would have the same protection as a landmark. Okay. So ultimately a 365-day potential review on demolition delays and a review by this body for significant alterations. So that's what the property owners need to decide. We think it should be decided by the property owners. If it's an opt-in to a district, that's great. But we think that that discussion should happen at the individual property owner level. In order to actually make this happen, we would suggest there is a vote. If it's not a unanimous, all 10 of us, 5 of us, 4 of us want to be in this district, then there be a vote. And we have to work through with the village board what those voting parameters are. Our original proposal had a 51% threshold. Some have suggested 75%. Some have suggested 100%. We need to work through those details. Margaret, does that help?
It does. Thank you.
Okay.
Can I interrupt for a second here?
Sure. Before you do, Paul, can we? I just want to make sure that Pat and Paul are.
Yeah, let's finish up Pat's questions.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things I'd like to add.
Did we answer that?
Yes, somewhat. I have a clear understanding of how to become a historic district. But then the final question of the 50% of the exterior, I just used your house as an example because there have been many additions. Is that 50% defined as the original historical structure, or is it defined as the addition going forward?
So, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Glenn, but since it is a building permit, it's a request that goes through the building code. My understanding is that 50% would be of the then existing structure. So it's not back to my small little cottage. If I'd want to do something else with my property, it would be what it is now.
Generally speaking, that's correct, Mr. Chairman. If and there's only one example I can think of in the village. If you were to landmark only part of a structure, I think in that case, we would only look at that part. That's a narrow situation. But if I can answer your question a bit differently, Mrs. Carollo, I should say. So right now, our calculation is based on floor area. So as you're knocking down interior walls, you start to increase the amount of floor area that's affected, and you can eventually tip into demolition. Afterwards, we're not looking at the area. Under these revisions, we're looking at the perimeter. Under this case, in theory, it might make it easier for an addition to be a demolition. I don't think that's too common. Usually we see when people build additions that they're changing their interior floor plan quite a bit. But let's say hypothetically you were to take, if you have a box, if your addition would enclose 50% of that box, two sides of it, in theory that would be a demolition here. But again, I think generally speaking, these rules will make fewer things count as demolitions and will reduce that number to start with by a lot. And then some of these rules that are under discussion would make that number that's left disposed of even faster. So I hope that's clear. I'm happy to elaborate if not. Clear as mud, maybe.
It is. Maybe clear as milk. How's that? I guess what I'm getting at is, you know, if Steve or I, you know, I know Deb's house as well, but those are the homes I know the best. And we'll use Steve's house as an example. If he bought his cottage by the lake, under these new revisions, would he be able to do those 3 additions within the 50%, affecting the 50% of the exterior today? If this went through, as well as our home over the years, you know, the previous owners added on, and then we added on a little bit more. Would we be able to do those additions with the new rules? Because I think in living in Lake Bluff and some of these cottages and homes, that is what a lot of buyers and younger families are looking to do.
So, since we're using my home as an example, I am tapped out. I cannot add any other impervious surface to my lot. My lot's too small. My house is maximized, so I can't. And without a variance from the village, that there could not be an additional. There could not be an addition to my house right now. For others who are in a different situation where there is the capacity of their lot to add, to build it, to have an addition, since this is a building permit question, if you can build and you can add more square footage, then sure, you can add an addition to a house that meets the standards of the building code. And the 50% threshold would be 50% of, if our proposal passes, 50% of the exterior walls of the structure that exists at the time the building permit is requested.
Thank you. I appreciate that explanation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us think through it. Sometimes you need a question and talk through it, and hopefully we got it right this time. Paul,
Steve,
you had, yeah.
Could I just clarify, and is that 50% of the streetscape? So if someone wanted to change 50% or 35% of the exterior, but it was in the back?
Yeah, it is 50% of the total structure.
Okay.
Which is, Lois, you bring up a good point, because if we have, even with landmarks, but certainly with old historic homes, what we are most interested in is preserving, to the degree that is feasible, the streetscape, the look from the street as you walk by. What individuals do in the back of their homes and what they do on the sides generally are great. I mean, two of my additions were just straight out the back. And you know, if you look at it from the front, and you wouldn't know that there was an addition back there, even though it might hit the 50% threshold. Those are fine. We're not looking just at streetscape for the 50% threshold. Paul, you had some?
A couple of comments. Pat Carollo, you mentioned when you were talking about historic districts, you talked about national districts and talked about Lake Forest. And so I want to carefully make the distinction between National Historic Districts and local historic districts. Here we're talking in Lake Bluff about having local historic districts. In Lake Forest, they have both local and National Historic Register districts. At the moment, we do not have any National Historic Register districts in Lake Bluff. We have a number of properties that are individually listed. The big David Adler houses are individually listed on the National Historic Register, but we don't have a National Historic Register district in Lake Bluff.
Mr. Bergman,
I've worked on designating 2 National Historic Register districts in Lake Forest. Deer Path Hill Estates, which most people know as Kingmuir Road, and West Park, which is the several block area surrounding West Park, just off of Green Bay Road. Both of those are National Historic Register districts. There are a total of 5 National Historic Register districts in Lake Forest, 3 of which have been designated as local historic register districts. So it gets a little confusing because you get sort of caught up in the language and all of the fine definitional detail. The 3 of the historic districts in Lake Forest are local, and that is East Lake Forest, that's Vine Avenue, and Green Bay Road. Those areas, because they're local districts, if you want to alter a house in one of those districts and you hit all of the points, it's 50 years old and all of that, that buys you a ticket to the Lake Forest Historic Preservation Commission. But for the 2 historic districts, Deer Path Hill Estates and West Park, those are national districts, but they are not local districts. So there, you run into the rules and regulations governing National Historic Register districts. And there, for a National Historic Register district, there is no prescription on any deed rights. And to put that into perspective, for a National Historic Register district, you can get your National Historic Register district on Monday, and you can bring in the bulldozer on Tuesday. There is no limitations. So what we're talking about in Lake Bluff is local historic register districts. Now, in doing 2 of these districts, I can tell you that these are not sneak attacks. They are not surprise parties in any shape, way, or form. For Deer Path Hill Estates, we probably had 15 or 20 Saturday morning, Thursday evening meetings in people's homes. And we went from all over the neighborhood. Everybody went and talked to their neighbors. Everybody stands on the street corner and talks to each other. Everybody meets in people's houses. I stood in all sorts of people's homes and explained what Deer Path Hill Estates was about. The same thing happened in West Park. In both situations, they had very, very large public meetings. Deer Path Hill Estates, we rented room several times. We rented rooms at the community center at Gorton. And then both of the districts resulted in having very large open houses as fundraisers to have people go and tour the various houses. So nominating any sort of district anywhere is a very large, very vocal, very public process. So there isn't any opportunity for anybody to be at all surprised by the situation. There's plenty of opportunity for everybody to ask and re-ask and triple ask and quadruple ask the same questions again and again until they're comfortable with them. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that going through a district process, whether it's a local district or a national district, there are some distinctions. There's no limitations on doing a national district. There are some limitations on doing a local district, as Steve has been explaining. But it is by no means is it any sort of sneak attack. It will never be a surprise to anybody. In Lake Bluff, you can plan on ending up at the gymnasium over at the school. Well, if we get past COVID, but you can plan on being at the gymnasium or at the village hall for some sort of public meeting for that. Lots of activity in that regard. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that.
Thanks, Paul. Do we have other questions or comments?
Just as one slight addendum.
Could I just ask
Oh,
to follow up on, oh, sorry, it's Deb. Could I just ask to follow up on what I was thinking was maybe Patty's question? Steve, could you build your house today? The changes that you made to your house, could that happen today under the new regulations? Patty, I don't know if that's the right question, but what I heard.
Sure. Yes, the answer is yes. I never had a variance for my house. And that wouldn't change. So the answer is definitely yes.
Okay, thanks.
And one way to think about that, Deb, and everybody else, is that this is a building process. So the normal building permit process, the zoning and the setbacks and side yard, front yard, all of bulk, height, all of that always has applied and still does apply. So that won't change. That is in no way will change. We're simply looking at a limited number of structures from a totally historic perspective, historic preservation perspective.
Okay, thank you.
You know, I gave Steve's house a Lake Bluff History Museum Distinguished Home Award and spent some time studying Steve's house and studying all of the earliest photography we have of the house when it was really a stable barn. And if you look at the arch form that's on the front of his house and the gable that the arch form fits into, and then the side box gable form that's on the side of it, all of those elements from the original house are still there. And so his house still very closely resembles the fact that it was a stable at one point, but has gone through the process of being winterized and being updated and being changed. And all of those changes are what we call vernacular changes. That's all things that happen to a building over time. And so the fact that the arch, which you used to drive the horse and buggy in, has now got steps and a doorway in it, is considered a change to the building, but it's considered a beneficial change, and it's still a historical change to the building. So in no way does filling in the arch that used to be the gable, or used to be the gates or the barn doors for the stable, the fact that the stable doors are gone does not detract from the historic nature of the building. So that building still retains a great deal of its historic character.
And without, we can get away from talking about my house now, thank you. Without talking about my house, that's what we are hoping people in Lake Bluff do. That, and the vast majority of people do. I think everybody on this call has done that when they've done a change. Changes are going to happen. They have to happen to older homes. They have to happen to make them livable in the 21st century. But we're hoping that we can provide some assistance in having those changes be in the spirit of the old structure. That the upgrade is complementary both to the house and to the neighborhood where that house is located. That's really what we're looking to do, and hopefully we can accomplish that. Okay, do we have others that have questions?
Mr. Chairman, I would just make one note. Member Bergman, I think all your points are important and well taken. I do have to correct you ever so slightly, which is that I am coming to you live from Lake Bluff's only National Register district. So it includes most of our downtown. So this and more you can learn from Lake Bluff online. Just a little.
You're right. That is but that is a commercial historic
only commercial,
yes.
District. Just important to.
I thank you.
Mostly teasing, but also important to recognize. I think that was important work by the commission and the Valet Center at one point. So.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Do we have any questions on what was our nominal topic tonight? That was some financial concerns, increase, decrease in the value of the home, harder to sell. Any thoughts? Okay. we have our last session is next Tuesday at 7 o'clock. Hopefully most of us will join. We have a couple of things to do. In addition to getting feedback, we have a couple of things that we need to do at that meeting. One, the most important of which is to summarize what we've heard and build consensus around how we wish to modify our proposed changes to the ordinance. So I'm going to give you a couple of things to think about, some homework before next week. We've discussed them in our development meetings over the last 2 years, and I've heard lots of comments about them over the last 3 meetings. So let me talk for a few minutes and just think about these, take some notes so that we can be prepared for next Tuesday. The first are some thoughts around landmarking. So we have, in our proposal, maintained the 50-year trigger. We had lots of discussions about should that be 25 or should it be 75? We've maintained the 50-year trigger, but added a commitment to expedite the process whenever we could. So we have some ideas around what an expedited process will look like, and Glenn and I will talk about those next week, so we can get a clear sense of what that actually means. But those are 2 separate things: the 50-year trigger for review, and then the expedited process. We talked about, so here's a to-do. Here's homework for the commission. So my infamous double handful, right? A double handful of structures. What are they? I would like all of you to come up with a double handful list, or as many as you're comfortable with. In beginning, we need to put our list together, because what we have committed to, and we want to confirm that we will do that, is identify those structures that would be reviewed for potential landmarking, reviewed with the property owners, as part of the discussion of changes to the ordinance. So we need to develop that list. There have been a number floating around over the years. I'd like to come up out of next week's meeting with a pretty much complete list. It probably will include more than we actually finally end up with. But we need to do that. We need to confirm the demolition delays. I think we've gotten clear on our focus on primarily demolitions to landmarks, and are we comfortable increasing the potential village delay from 150 max to 365 days, again, for those limited numbers that will be demolished, and alterations maximum of 60 days, again, to landmarks. So we need to confirm that we're comfortable with that. We need to put together the process for districts. So if anyone wants to think about the concept, first of all, the concept that districts are something that we should have in the ordinance, that they should be nomination should be by the property owners, so that the commission wouldn't be involved in identifying districts, but property owners would. We need to have a proposed voting process and structural process for how we might make that happen. I would also like to continue a discussion that we actually started back in 2019 around tools and incentives for historic preservation. And Glenn, I'm going to ask you if you could send out to the commission a copy of the March 16, 2019 deck that we used in the workshop with the village board, that Saturday morning workshop, for those of you that remember that. Because in that document, pages 14 through 18, 15 through 18, I guess, we have a number of proposed tools that are incentive-based rather than penalty-based, and we really haven't talked much about those, and I'd like to make sure we get that into our discussion as well. So we talked about knowledge tools, right? Lake Bluff Online, more information about the property, rehabilitation goals, the concept of becoming stewards of a property, the concept of rehabilitation, incentives if possible. We talked about building fees, property tax freezes, zoning flexibility so that if you're committed to preserving a historic structure, a landmark especially, and in order to do that, you need some zoning flexibility, side yard, backyard, height, to make that home livable but maintain its streetscape feeling. We want to talk about potentially recommending those kinds of things, and redevelopment goals. So those are in that March 2019, 2-year-old now report. That, Glenn, if you could send those out.
We certainly can.
And I think that's it, unless we have other questions from our audience. Or questions or comments from the commissioners. We'll actually open up for commissioner report, which is agenda item number 5. And Glenn, any additional comments from staff?
Certainly. Just by way of interest, as some of you may be aware, I suppose I would give 2 reports. The first, the former Arden Shore Children and Family Services property, or I believe the Arden Shore Children's Home, as it was known at one point, I should say, up by Shore Acres Country Club, recently received a subdivision.
Glenn, can you speak up a bit? I can't hear you.
Certainly. Here. Is that any better for you?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Sorry about that. So 2 items I would report, Mr. Chairman. The first, the former Arden Shore Children and Family Services property back in the 90s, or I believe it was just called the Arden Shore Children's Home, before that time, has lied vacant for about 25, 30 years. Here soon, the PCZBA has made a recommendation on the redevelopment of that property. Essentially, the western half to 2/3, closer to 2/3, would be a driving range for Shore Acres Golf Course, and then the eastern third or so roughly would be an estate with some outbuildings, some accessory residences, consistent with the other developments in that area. So there's no historic structures left on that property. Certainly it's a important historic site in the village, and an important site in the development of the village, foreseen by the village's comprehensive plan. So I think that's interesting to take note of. The second item, again, no real changes to the situation regarding Stonebridge. We remain in litigation. There was a court decision here, I believe it was rendered about this time last week, regarding the continued litigation with Stonebridge. But again, not all items have been dismissed that are at issue in that case. Certainly no movement on any demolition, or nothing has changed really. And again, I hope you can understand there are limits to questions I can answer due to our ongoing litigation, but happy to answer any questions from the group. Okay.
All right. Any other final thoughts? Next week will be, in addition to our normal feedback discussion with our residents, will be important for us to get our arms around changes that we're looking to recommend to the village board. That's what they asked us to do. They remanded our revised ordinance back to us to go through this outreach process. We need to synthesize that feedback and give them our revised suggestions, which is the revisions to the ordinance. So we need to give Glenn and the village attorney on Tuesday night some guidance so that they can begin pulling together the formal documents, and then also have this conversation around incentives, which wouldn't be in the revision to the ordinance, but I envision this to be a separate, almost a cover letter, a sense of the commission as to what we would recommend as next steps for historic preservation incentives within the village to complement the changes that we're proposing as part of the ordinance itself. So that's our agenda for Tuesday. And if there's nothing else, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I so moved.
Second?
Second.
I didn't catch your date. I assumed you caught motion and second, Glenn. So
Yes, sir.
roll call vote, please.
Certainly. Member Bergman,
Yes.
Member Church,
Yes.
Member Liebolt,
Yes.
Member Minor, Member Minor,
You're muted.
Just go like this.
Yes.
Member Nickel. Sorry about that.
Yes.
Vice Chair Richardson
Yes.
and Chair Kraus.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you all, and thank you to our audience. We very much appreciate your comments. Have a good week. We'll catch up
Thank
next
you.
Tuesday.
You
Take
too,
care.
everybody. Great.
Thank you,
Yeah.
everyone.
Warm.
Take care.
Bye.